Hello, and welcome to the Cold channel. Today we'll be taking a look at the proxy wars that took place in Latin America during the Cold War. The Cold War was a conflict that mainly involved the two global superpowers of the 20th century, the Soviet Union, now known as Russia, and the United States. The political and social tension between these two nations caused over 80 small-scale conflicts on countries worldwide, some of these being situated in Latin America. In these conflicts, the American capitalistic ideology clashed with the semi-newly developed communist ideas that began acquiring momentum right after the Russian Revolution, resulting in massive confrontations and the involvement of both parties in global affairs. A large question that we'll be seeking to answer for you in this video is, how did the ideologies of the United States and the Soviet Union affect the historical events that took place in some Latin American countries?
Before the Cold War was properly recognized, the United States and Soviet Russia were actually allies during the Second World War. They worked together in order to overthrow the fascist German government while dealing with their own tensions. Tensions between the US and the USSR rose as early as 1917, when the United States refused to recognize the newly established Soviet Union as a country. These conflicts carried on to World War II and the post-war era. During World War II, the United States had refused to share their research on nuclear-scale weapons with the Soviets, later on also ditching them to fight off the Nazis by themselves. The Cold War involved a series of events worldwide, especially in Latin America, in which ideologies between the United States and Soviet Union clashed. These conflicts generally involved some degree of participation from the United States or the Soviet Union, one way or another. The Cold War can also be considered an important event in history of the world, as it could have easily resulted in a nuclear warfare between these two superpowers. An unclassified document of the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act, published during the time of the conflict, explained, Soviet support and guidance for Latin American revolutionary movements now focus on encouragement of broad revolutionary coalitions, uniting pro-Soviet communist parties with their traditional left-wing rivals, creation of loyal military components, use of extra-hemispheric and hemispheric intermediaries, training of revolutionaries. The tension between these two empires could be felt.
In Chile, the effects of the conflicts between the US and USSR were mainly political, as they affected the leader of the country. In September 4, 1970, Salvador Allende, the representative of Unidad Popular, a coalition of various leftist political parties, became president, making it the first time in history for a socialist leader to be democratically elected. In terms of the Cold War, Allende was backed militarily, politically, and economically by the Soviet Union. In 1970, Allende received millions of pesos for his political campaign. In 1971, he also received 100 million pesos and millions of tons of wheat in order to repair the damages caused by the earthquake. In the beginning of 1973, he was supplied with tanks and weapons in case there was a military conflict. During his time as president, Allende was focused on making high school education for everyone and university more accessible, in addition to making it state-funded. Another important aspect of Allende's presidency was the nationalization of copper, which was based on giving the state as much power as possible over international mines. Despite the fact that Allende's first year as president was marked as successful because of a decrease in inflation and public services working, the country soon began its downfall. His ideals were still considered very extreme for Chile, which is why by 1971 many left and right-wing extremist groups that opposed Allende were created. There were multiple strikes made by services that were essential for the country, like the one by truck owners of October 1972. The first option was that the United States not do anything against President Allende and allow him to consolidate himself. It was based on having a strong presence in Chile and waiting to see how Allende managed to solve the internal issues, so that they could use them in their problem. This was the modus vivendi strategy, and it was introduced by Kissinger to Nixon in the letter The White House in November 5, 1970, when he said, "This school of thought, which is essentially state's position, argues that we really do not have the capability of preventing Allende from consolidating himself or forcing his favor, that the main course of events in Chile will be determined primarily by the Allende government and its reactions to the internal situation, and that the best thing we can do in these situations is maintain a relationship and a presence in Chile so that over the long haul we may be able to foster and influencing domestic trends favorable to our interests." The second option was that the United States take a hostile approach and counter Allende's power while he is weak. The thought behind this was that when he became powerful and consolidated himself in Chile, then there would be no way back. It was based on making an economic embargo, trying to get international support against Allende, and publicizing the US's concern and hostility. Kissinger talks about this on the same letter when he says, the OD, CIA, and some state people, on the other hand, argue that it is patent that Allende is our enemy, that he will move counter to us just as soon as and as strongly as he feels he can. That when his hostility is manifest to us, it will be because he is consolidating his power, that it will be really too late to do very much. The process is irreversible. On September 11, 1973, the Chilean military, in alliance with the police, declared a national strike against the president. The United States-supported Army General Augusto Pinochet, being the leader, spoke to Allende and told him that his only option was to be exiled, that they would bomb La Moneda. Allende did not agree with this option and instead decided to kill himself. Pinochet was declared as the president in 1974. Pinochet's years in power are marked by the term fascism, which is a highly authoritarian extreme right-wing government. Pinochet used 10% of the money that he stayed on intelligence and military. He used his new military power to suppress any parties that went against Partido Nacional. In alliance with the United States, Operation Condor began. In fear of Chile becoming the next Cuba and to secure Pinochet's power, the United States launched a counter-revolution against the people that were challenging the government. Its main branch was the School of the Americas, situated in Panama. Chilean soldiers were taught torture methods by CIA officers, in addition to Chilean intelligence officers being taught assassination methods. The United States played a big role in Chile and its government during the military overtaking, since they were supporting the killing of people who were a threat to what they wanted. In addition, they supported overthrowing an elected president and suppression of democracy through elections for 17 years, just so that capitalism was not threatened. Note that in the solutions proposed by Kissinger, none mentioned the well-being of the people.
Nicaragua is a country that comes up quite often when speaking about the Cold War. This is because the effects of the Cold War ideologies clashes and has an effect on the citizens, causing the Nicaraguan Revolution. During the Cold War, the United States began taking into effect specific policies that would make sure that no left-wing extremists, communists, would take control over the Latin American countries. Because of these policies, the United States began supporting the existing governments of the area, making them more powerful and therefore creating a larger gap within societies and social hierarchies. In Nicaragua's case, the United States ended up backing up the Somoza regime, which ended up being a family dynasty that would last decades, whom they had also helped establish. This happened after the US had already helped the Somoza, Anastasio, beat Augusto Sandino, whose ideology involved attempting to rid Nicaragua of American influence and had fought against the United States military forces, who came with the excuse of the seeking of ensuring peace and democracy. After fighting off the United States Marine, who were superior in various aspects of combat, the National Guard of Nicaragua was formed, led by none other than Anastasio Somoza. Sandino was executed and betrayed by Somoza, whose family would later rise to power. With Somoza in power, the United States became allied with Nicaragua, helping the Somoza rule the country through methods that would reach economic deprivation, brutality, and even murder. Somoza even stated, "I'll give this country peace even if I have to kill every other man in Nicaragua." Because of these actions, people began to rebel, resulting in the assassination of Anastasio Somoza, whose place was taken on by his son, who also governed the country in an oppressive manner. With this new oppression, a group of people would appear. These people had Marxist beliefs and would call themselves Sandinistas. During the 1960s, the Sandinistas managed to obtain the support of those who were being oppressed by their current government, the poor population. Because of actions like these, this regime was weakened but could also manage to stay strong because of its alliance with the United States, one of the global superpowers of the time. The public outbreaks began to get worse and, with more time, more aggressive towards the politics of the country, resulting in the overtaking of important figures such as the National Palace and forcing government to fulfill demands. According to an article published in 1979, the one and only international coup occurred in Managua when, in December of 1974, they attacked the residence of a prominent Nicaraguan during a reception for the US ambassador, seizing 41 hostages and killing 3. To obtain the hostages' release, Somoza was forced to free 14 guerrillas from prison, give the Sandinistas $1 million in ransom and a plane to fly to Cuba, and published a 12,000-word denunciation of his own government as the most despicable dictatorship in Latin America. In the end, Somoza was murdered during Operation Reptile, an organized mission accomplished by 7 Sandinistas that resulted in the ambush and assassination of Somoza. After his death, A Junta of National Reconstruction ruled Nicaragua as a transitional government until official democratic presidential elections took place, resulting in the rise of Daniel Ortega as the president of Nicaragua and the new age for the country.
During the Cold War, as it can be considered as a tactical advantage by the Soviets. This is because the United States had military and nuclear facilities in Europe, including Turkey, a country in which a military facility would have the range to launch a direct attack on Moscow. As the Office of the Historian explains, it was the moment when the two superpowers came closer to nuclear conflict. The crisis was unique in a number of ways, featuring calculations and miscalculations, as well as direct and secret communications and miscommunications between the two sides. During the Cold War, the USSR managed to spread its influence to Cuba, causing a rise of the country that was supported by the communists and Russia. In the end, the United States attempted to intervene on the Cuban politics by providing military training to Cuban exiles in order to attack the country. This attack would be known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The lack of strategy from the exiles and the lack of involvement in the actual combat from the United States ended up with a 3-day defeat in the hands of the Castro regime. This defeat was negative for not only the exiles but also to the United States. Not only was the attack clearly forced by the United States in the eyes of the world, but it also strengthened the bond between Cuba and the Soviets, as these promised to protect the Cubans from further American attacks. As the Cold War rages, the tension in Cuba increases and the USSR steps into the Cuban soil, later having a secret meeting with President Castro. This was in July 1962, in which Nikita Khrushchev and Castro came to an agreement to establish nuclear missiles in Cuba to prevent further invasions from the US with the objective to overthrow Castro. Later on, the US received information of the construction of missile bases and USSR bombers in Cuba from a U-2 aircraft that was performing a surveillance flight on both October 14, where it found the construction of missile bases, and September 4, when it discovered the USSR bomber. As a result of these discoveries, President Kennedy called into a naval blockade, calling it quarantine, in order to prevent any USSR shipment of possible mass destruction weapons. Also, President Kennedy sent a letter to Khrushchev telling that weapons would not be allowed to be transported into Cuba, and that the missile bases should be dismantled. Later, on October 24, Khrushchev responded back to Kennedy stating that the USSR was allowed to transport ships into Cuba, and that what Kennedy was doing was an act of aggression. The effect is that some ships returned and other stayed, as there were no weapons. Espionage in Cuba remained and missile bases were nearly fully operational, moving the US forces into DEFCON 2, a state of alert and approach side of the war. Then, the 26th of October, Kennedy had the idea to make a deep strike into Cuba to take down the missile, but the same day a letter from Khrushchev was received. It stated that the USSR would move the missile bases from Cuba only if the US would avoid invading it. In October 27, the USSR shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba, and additionally Khrushchev sent another letter asking the US to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The second letter was ignored and the first one was taken in consideration. General Robert Kennedy then had a secret meeting with Anastasio, a Soviet ambassador, to ask for the removal of the missiles in Turkey, only to have Anastasio know that the missiles were already going to be taken away either way. Another letter from Khrushchev was sent in a call to dismantle the missiles from Cuba and remove them. Yet the US stood strong and kept the naval blockade up until the Il-28 bombers were removed. This blockade was removed on the 20th of November of 1962. According to the website CubanMissileCrisis.org, the conflict over Cuba was resolved when Kennedy offered a public deal in which the United States pledged not to invade Cuba if the Soviet Union withdrew its missiles. A private ultimatum threatening to attack Cuba within 24 hours if the offer was rejected, and a secret sweetener that promised to withdraw the US missiles from Turkey within 6 months. The crisis was resolved at last minute when Khrushchev accepted the US offer.
In the end, the Cold War is a topic that shows the power that people have to destroy each other and themselves. With the progression of technology came the progression of massively destructive weapons with the capability to wipe out entire cities. These weapons, combined with the human psychology, ended up causing what would have possibly been a worldwide catastrophe or even World War III. The Cold War was an event that was truly antagonizing for both parties involved, and, in the end, managed to show how influential government can be to its citizens. The US and USSR managed to influence not only governments worldwide, but also managed to redirect the visions of their country through propaganda and the media.